Imagine charging into battle as a mighty king, sword in hand, only to feel the cold grip of defeat snatch your freedom away, turning you from ruler to prisoner in a foreign land, where luxury hides the chains of humiliation. Chapter 1. The Battle of Poitiers. King's downfall. The Battle of Poitiers in 1356. This wasn't just any skirmish. It was a brutal clash in the 100 Years' War between England and France, where King John II, known as John the Good, led his forces against the English army commanded by Edward, the Black Prince. Picture this. It's September 19th, 1356, near the town of Poitiers in western France. The French had been chasing the English raiders who were pillaging the countryside, and John thought he had them cornered. He had a massive army, estimates say around 16,000 men, including knights, foot soldiers, and crossbowmen, while the English were outnumbered, with about 6,000 to 7,000 troops. But numbers don't always win wars, right? The English had superior tactics, longbowmen, who could rain arrows like a storm, and a defensive position on a hill with vineyards and hedges providing natural barriers. John, at 37 years old, was no stranger to the throne. He'd been king since 1350, inheriting a realm plagued by the Black Death, economic woes, and this endless war with England over claims to the French crown. He was called the Good for his chivalrous nature, brave, generous, but maybe a bit impulsive. On that fateful day, he divided his army into 4 divisions, planning to attack in waves. The first wave, led by his son, the Dauphin Charles, charged but got bogged down in the terrain and under English arrow fire. The second and third waves followed, but chaos ensued as knights dismounted to fight on foot, clashing with Englishmen. John himself led the 4th division, fighting valiantly from horseback, swinging his battle-axe like a legend from the old tales. Eyewitness accounts describe him shouting encouragement to his men, refusing to flee even as the battle turned against them. But the English were clever. The Black Prince, Edward III's son and a military genius at just 26, had positioned his archers to flank the French advances. Those longbows decimated the charging knights' arrows, piercing armor and horses alike. As the French lines broke, a final English counterattack sealed the deal. John fought like a lion, surrounded by his loyal knights, but he was overwhelmed. Wounded in the face, he surrendered to a French knight in English service named Denis de Morbic, who then presented him to the Black Prince. Can you imagine the shock? A king captured on the battlefield was humiliating, but the Black Prince treated him with respect, even dining with him that night and praising his bravery. John reportedly said something like, "Today you have conquered the most fearless of kings," showing that chivalric spirit even in defeat. The aftermath was devastating for France. Not only was the king prisoner, but so were thousands of nobles, including John's son Philip and many high-ranking lords. The battle killed or captured a huge chunk of France's elite, leaving the country leaderless and vulnerable back home. The Dauphin Charles, only 18, had to step up as regent, dealing with rebellions, peasant uprisings like the Jacquerie, and scheming nobles. Meanwhile, John was whisked away to Bordeaux, then shipped to England in April 1357 aboard a vessel called the St. Mary. He arrived in London to a mix of curiosity and triumph, paraded through the streets on a white charger, but treated as a royal guest, not a chained criminal now. Let's talk about what this captivity meant right from the start. John wasn't thrown into a dungeon that wasn't the medieval way for kings. He was housed in luxury at places like the Savoy Palace in London, complete with his own court. He bought fine wines, spices, horses, even kept falcons for hunting, and an astrologer for advice. Records show he spent lavishly, almost like he was on an extended vacation. But make no mistake, this was gilded imprisonment, the tortured part. It wasn't physical chains, though the title evokes that image metaphorically, but the psychological and political agony. France was bleeding money to fund raids and defenses without him. Taxes skyrocketed, and the English demanded a massive ransom, initially for million gold crowns, later negotiated down. For practical tips on understanding this era, think about how chivalry played a role. Knights followed a code where capturing a high-value prisoner like a king was like winning the lottery. They could ransom them for fortunes. The Black Prince earned huge prestige from this, and Edward III saw it as leverage to end the war on favorable terms. If you're into history reenactments or games like Crusader Kings, this battle is a perfect example of how terrain and archery can flip the odds. Try simulating it to see how John's decisions might have changed the outcome. Wrapping up this chapter, the Battle of Poitiers wasn't just a military loss. It kicked off 4 years of uncertainty, where John's absence crippled France and set the stage for grueling negotiations. But how did life really look for a captive king in England? That takes us into the daily realities of his so-called tortured exile, which we'll explore next. Stay tuned. Chapter 2. A King in Exile. John II's life in London. Picture this. You're a king, used to ruling a vast kingdom, but now you're hundreds of miles from home, living in a foreign land where your every move is watched. That's where we find King John II after his capture at the Battle of Poitiers in 1356. By spring 1357, John had been shipped from Bordeaux to London, landing in a world that was both lavish and suffocating. Let's dive into what daily life looked like for this captive king, how he balanced royal dignity with the reality of being a glorified prisoner, and what this meant for France, left leaderless in his absence. John's new home wasn't a damp cell or a grim tower. Instead, he was lodged in some of England's finest residences, starting with the Savoy Palace, a sprawling mansion on the Thames owned by the Duke of Lancaster. This place was fit for royalty. Think grand halls, tapestries, and servants bustling about. John was also moved to other spots, like Windsor Castle and the Tower of London, but not its dungeons. He got the royal apartments. Historical records, like those from the English Exchequer, show he lived like a king, with a personal entourage of French nobles also captured at Poitiers. He had cooks, musicians, even a tailor to keep him in style. He spent heavily on luxuries, by 70 gallons of wine in one go, importing spices like saffron, and keeping hunting dogs and falcons. One account mentions him paying for a clock, a rare and fancy item back then, showing he wasn't exactly roughing it. But don't let the glitz fool you. This was a gilded cage. John couldn't leave, and every purchase, every letter he sent, was monitored by his English hosts. The chronicler Jean Froissart notes that John was allowed to entertain, hosting feasts for other French prisoners and even English nobles. He'd play chess, listen to minstrels, and keep up appearances as a chivalrous monarch. Yet, the psychological toll was real. Imagine being treated like a guest, but knowing you're a bargaining chip in a high-stakes game. The English king, Edward III, and his son, the Black Prince, were polite. John dined with them, and they praised his valor, but their kindness had a purpose. They wanted a massive ransom and territorial concessions to weaken France. Back in France, things were falling apart. Without John, the kingdom was like a ship without a captain. His son, the Dauphin Charles, was only 18 and struggled to hold the realm together. The French nobility was fractured, some loyal to the crown, others scheming for power. The economy was in shambles, with the Black Death still lingering and English raids burning villages. Taxes, called aids, were hiked to fund the war and John's ransom, which sparked resentment among peasants and merchants alike. In 1358, this tension exploded into the Jacquerie, a violent peasant uprising in northern France, where farmers, fed up with taxes and noble abuses, attacked castles with pitchforks and clubs. Charles crushed it brutally, but it showed how John's absence left a power vacuum. John's life in London wasn't all feasts and falcons, though he was under constant pressure to negotiate his freedom. The English demanded 4 million gold crowns, fortune that could bankrupt France. Negotiations dragged on, with John sending letters to his son, urging him to raise funds. He also had to deal with political games. Some French nobles, like Charles of Navarre, saw John's captivity as a chance to push their own agendas, stirring trouble back home. John's letters, preserved in archives, reveal a man trying to stay regal while grappling with guilt over leaving his kingdom in chaos. He even consulted an astrologer, a common practice, to predict when he might return home. For a practical angle, think about how this scenario mirrors modern leadership crises. A CEO or president stuck abroad during a crisis can't just zoom in to fix things. John faced a similar disconnect, relying on messengers who took weeks to deliver news. If you're studying history or writing a novel set in this era, focus on the contrast between John's lavish prison and France's suffering. It's a great way to show the human side of medieval politics. You could even role-play this in a strategy game. Imagine managing a kingdom while your leader's stuck negotiating from enemy territory. To wrap up, John's time in London was a strange mix of royal privilege and mental strain. He kept up the image of a king, but the weight of his captivity and its impact on France hung heavy. Up next, we'll explore how the negotiations for his release unfolded, with high-stakes diplomacy that could make or break a kingdom. Keep watching to see how John's fate took shape. Chapter 3. The price of freedom negotiations and ransom demands. Being a king, surrounded by luxury, yet every conversation boils down to one thing: how much is your freedom worth? By 1357, John II, the captive French king, was deep in negotiations with the English to secure his release. This chapter dives into the high-stakes diplomacy that unfolded in London, the staggering ransom demands, and the political chess game that kept France on edge. Let's explore how John navigated this tense period, balancing his royal pride with the desperate need to return home. The English, led by King Edward III, knew they had a golden opportunity. Holding John wasn't just about money, it was a chance to cripple France in the 100 Years' War. Their initial demand was a jaw-dropping 4 million gold crowns, roughly equivalent to France's annual revenue. To put that in perspective, it's like asking a modern government to cough up billions overnight. But it wasn't just cash. Edward wanted huge chunks of French territory, including Aquitaine and parts of Normandy, to be handed over without feudal obligations. This would make England's holdings in France independent, a massive blow to French sovereignty. The chronicler Froissart reports that John, despite his chivalrous demeanor, was stunned by the terms but had little choice but to engage. Negotiations happened in fits and starts, often at the Savoy Palace or other grand venues where John was housed. He'd meet with English envoys, sometimes Edward himself, surrounded by advisors and scribes. John's team included loyal French nobles also captured at Poitiers, like his son Philip, who helped draft counteroffers. The process was slow. To France took weeks, carried by couriers on horseback or ship. John proposed lower ransoms, starting at 1,000,000 crowns, and offered fewer territories, but the English held firm. They knew France was in chaos, with the Dauphin Charles struggling to maintain order. Edward's strategy was to drag things out, letting France weaken while John's absence fueled unrest. Back in France, raising the ransom was a nightmare. The Dauphin tried to levy new taxes, but the French Estates General, a proto-parliament of nobles, clergy, and townsfolk, pushed back. They demanded reforms in exchange for funds, limiting royal power, a bold move in a monarchy. In 1357, the Estates General in Paris agreed to a tax to raise 600,000 crowns, but collecting it was another story. Peasants were already squeezed dry, and merchants hoarded cash to avoid ruin. Some nobles even suggested abandoning John, arguing France couldn't afford the price. Meanwhile, Charles of Navarre, a cunning noble with his own claim to the throne, stirred rebellion, meeting with English agents to undermine the Dauphin. It was a diplomatic mess, with John caught in the middle, getting reports of betrayal and unrest. John's personal role in negotiations showed his resilience. He wrote letters, preserved in French archives, urging his son to stay strong and unify the nobles. He also leaned on his chivalric reputation, charming English lords to soften their stance. One story tells of John hosting a lavish dinner for English negotiators, serving rare wines and cracking jokes, all to build goodwill. But the pressure was intense. He consulted astrologers to predict favorable outcomes, a sign of his anxiety. The English, meanwhile, paraded him at public events like a royal trophy to remind everyone of their victory. For a practical tip, if you're studying medieval diplomacy or writing a historical drama, focus on the power dynamics here. Negotiations weren't just about money. They were about prestige and survival. A fun exercise is to map out the key players, John Edward, the Dauphin Charles of Navarre, their motives like a Game of Thrones style plot. If you're into strategy games, try simulating a ransom scenario. How do you balance paying off enemies while keeping your kingdom from collapsing? To wrap up, the negotiations for John's release were a grueling test of patience and strategy. The massive ransom and territorial demands pushed France to the brink, while John played a delicate game of charm and compromise. Next, we'll dive into the Treaty of London in 1358, where these talks took a dramatic turn, with terms that could reshape Europe. Stay tuned for more. Chapter 4. The Treaty of London, France. On the brink, picture yourself as a king. Far from home, signing a deal that could save you but doom your kingdom. In 1358, John II faced this grim reality with the First Treaty of London, a pivotal moment. In his Captivity, this chapter explores the treaty's harsh terms, the desperate French reaction, and how it pushed France closer to collapse. Let's jump into this critical turning point. The English, holding John captive, saw their chance to force a game-changing agreement. The First Treaty of London, signed in May 1358, demanded France pay 4 million gold crowns and cede vast territories, about a third of the kingdom, including Aquitaine, Poitou, and chivalry of French overlordship. This would make England a major power on French soil. John, under pressure in London, agreed, hoping it would secure his freedom. He sent envoys to Paris to push the treaty, but the Dauphin Charles and the Estates General balked. The terms were seen as a national humiliation, stripping France of wealth and land while taxes already crushed the people. In France, the treaty sparked outrage. The Dauphin, barely holding the kingdom together, faced riots and defiance. Merchants and peasants, burdened by war taxes, refused to fund what they called a betrayal. Charles of Navarre, ever the opportunist, fueled dissent, rallying nobles against the treaty. Chroniclers like Froissart note that Paris was a powder keg, with citizens arming themselves against both English threats and royal demands. John's letters urged compliance, but his absence made him seem out of touch, weakening his authority for a practical angle. If you're into history or strategy games, imagine negotiating as John balancing personal freedom against national pride. Try drafting a treaty in a role-play exercise, weighing what you'd sacrifice to save your skin. It's a stark lesson in medieval power plays. To wrap up, the First Treaty of London was a desperate bid for John's freedom that nearly tore France apart. Next, we'll see how this failure led to even tougher negotiations and a second treaty. Testing John's resolve and France's endurance. Keep watching. Chapter 5. The Second Treaty of London. Fragile hope. Imagine signing a deal you know your kingdom can barely stomach, all to escape a gilded prison. In early 1359, King John II faced this dilemma as negotiations for his release took a new turn with the Second Treaty of London. This chapter dives into the revised terms, the growing desperation in France, and how John's hopes for freedom clashed with his kingdom's survival. Let's explore this critical moment in his captivity. After the First Treaty of London collapsed, amid French outrage, the English tightened the screws. By May 1359, they proposed the Second Treaty of London, and it was even harsher. The ransom stayed at 4 million gold crowns. But the territorial demands grew. England now wanted nearly half of France, including Normandy, Anjou, and Maine, plus all of Aquitaine, free from French control. This would have turned France into a shadow of itself, with England dominating the West. John, still in London, felt the weight of his captivity, now over 2 years long. Chronicles suggest he was weary, his health strained by stress, yet he signed the treaty, believing it was his only path home in France. The reaction was chaos. The Dauphin Charles, leading in his father's absence, called the Estates General to debate the terms, but they rejected it outright. The French saw it as surrender. Losing land their ancestors fought for was unthinkable. Taxes to fund the ransom were already sparking revolts, and cities like Paris were on edge, with militias forming against both English raids and royal collectors. Charles of Navarre, ever scheming, used the treaty to rally support, painting the Dauphin as weak. Meanwhile, John sent urgent letters, begging France to accept the terms. But his pleas fell on deaf ears, as loyalty to the crown frayed. The treaty's failure wasn't just a diplomatic blow. It deepened John's isolation. English records show he was still treated like royalty, feasting, hunting, even buying new robes. But the pressure was mounting. He relied on astrologers for hope, a sign of his growing despair. For France, the treaty's collapse meant more war, as Edward III prepared a massive invasion to enforce his demands. Landing at Calais in late 1359, For a practical takeaway, if you're studying history or writing a medieval saga, think about the stakes of diplomacy under pressure. A fun exercise is to role-play as the Dauphin, deciding whether to defy your captive king or bankrupt the kingdom. It's a crash course in loyalty versus pragmatism. To wrap up, the Second Treaty of London was a desperate gamble that failed, pushing France toward war and John deeper into captivity. Next, we'll explore Edward III's invasion and how it set the stage for a final deal to free the king. Stay tuned. Chapter 6. Edward's invasion France. Under siege. Imagine your kingdom crumbling while you're stuck in a foreign palace, powerless to help. In late 1359, King John II faced this nightmare as Edward III launched a massive invasion of France to enforce the failed Second Treaty of London. This chapter dives into the English campaign, its impact on a leaderless France, and how it pushed John closer to a breaking point. Let's uncover this dramatic escalation in his Captivity saga. With the Second Treaty rejected, Edward III decided to force France's hand. In October 1359, he landed at Calais with an army of about 10,000 men-knights, archers, and men-at-arms aiming to seize Reims, the city where French kings were crowned and claimed the French throne. The English marched through northern France, burning villages and plundering supplies to weaken resistance. Chronicles from the time, like those of Jean Froissart, describe a trail of destruction: crops torched, livestock slaughtered, and towns abandoned as peasants fled. The goal wasn't just conquest, but to break France's will, forcing them to accept the treaty's terms or pay John's ransom. In France, the Dauphin Charles scrambled to respond. Only 21, he faced a fractured realm, nobles bickered, and cities struggled under heavy taxes. He adopted a defensive strategy, avoiding pitched battles and fortifying key cities like Reims and Paris. French garrisons harassed English supply lines, making the invaders' march grueling. By December, Edward reached Reims, but couldn't breach its walls. Cold, hungry, and battered by winter rains, his army faltered. By early 1360, he shifted toward Paris, hoping to intimidate the Dauphin into submission, but Charles held firm, refusing to fight openly. For John, still in London, the invasion was a gut punch. Letters from France, preserved in archives, show his anguish as he heard of the devastation. He was allowed to send advice to Charles, urging him to negotiate, but his influence was limited. The English kept him comfortable. Records show he bought new horses and hosted feasts, but the news of his kingdom's suffering weighed heavily. His health reportedly worsened, with stress and confinement taking a toll, though he kept up appearances, attending court events with a forced smile. The invasion's failure was a turning point. By April 1360, Edward's army was exhausted, hit by storms and disease. A freak hailstorm near Chartres, dubbed the Black Monday Storm, killed men and horses, seen as a divine sign. Edward, low on supplies, agreed to peace talks at Bretigny. This gave John a glimmer of hope, as negotiations could finally lead to his release. For a practical angle, if you're into historical strategy, try gaming out Edward's campaign. How would you counter a stronger, mobile enemy with a weakened kingdom? It's a lesson in resilience under pressure. Writers can draw inspiration from the Dauphin's defiance, crafting characters who lead through crisis. To wrap up, Edward's invasion ravaged France, but failed to break it, setting the stage for new peace talks. Next, we'll explore the Treaty of Bretigny, where John's fate hung in the balance as France fought to bring him home. Keep watching. Chapter 7. The Treaty of Bretagne. A path to freedom. Imagine being a captive king, your kingdom battered by war, and finally seeing a glimmer of hope in a new deal that could set you free, but at a cost that might break your nation. By May 1360, King John II was at this crossroads with the Treaty of Bretagne, a pivotal moment in his 4-year captivity. This chapter dives deep into the negotiations, the treaty's terms, and the fragile hope it offered France, all while John grappled with his role as a distant ruler. Let's unpack this critical step. Toward his release, after Edward III's failed invasion of France in 1359 to 1360, both sides were exhausted. The English army, battered by weather, disease, and French guerrilla tactics, couldn't sustain the campaign. France, meanwhile, was reeling from raids, rebellions, and economic collapse. The Dauphin Charles, leading in his father's absence, knew peace was the only way to stabilize the kingdom. Negotiations began in April 1360 at Bretagne, a village near Chartres, with envoys from both sides hammering out terms. John, still in London, was kept informed through messengers, his input limited but crucial. He was desperate to return home, but the price of freedom was steep. The Treaty of Bretagne, signed on May 8, 1360, was a compromise, though it heavily favored England. The ransom for John was set at 3 million gold crowns, down from 4 million, but still a staggering sum, equivalent to years of French tax revenue. England would also gain control of Aquitaine, Gascony, Poitou, and Calais, about a third of France, as sovereign territories, meaning no feudal ties to the French crown. In return, Edward III renounced his claim to the French throne, a symbolic win for France, but little comfort given the territorial losses. John agreed to the terms, signing alongside English negotiators, and sent the treaty to Paris for ratification. Chronicles, like those of Froissart, describe John's relief, though he knew the deal would strain France's loyalty to him. In France, the treaty was met with grim acceptance. The Dauphin Charles and the Estates General, worn down by war, approved it in October 1360, though not without debate. Raising the ransom meant new taxes, which fell heavily on peasants and merchants already crushed by war costs. Records show France scrambled to collect gold and silver, melting down church bells, and seizing merchant goods. The Dauphin also had to contend with rogue nobles, like Charles of Navarre, who opposed the treaty to weaken the crown. Despite the unrest, preparations began to send the first ransom payment, 600,000 crowns to secure John's release. 4. John, the treaty was a personal lifeline but a political tightrope. He was still treated like royalty in London, with feasts and hunting trips. But his letters reveal a man haunted by his kingdom's plight. He consulted astrologers, a common practice, to gauge the treaty's success, showing his anxiety. English, meanwhile, kept up the pressure, parading John at public events to remind France of their leverage. One account describes him riding through London on a white charger, smiling to crowds but under guard, a king in name only. Practically speaking, the Treaty of Bretagne is a masterclass in medieval diplomacy, if you're studying history or writing. A novel, focus on the trade-offs: land and money for peace, but at the cost of national pride. For strategy gamers, try simulating the treaty's impact. How do you rebuild a kingdom after losing a third of it? The treaty also shows how personal leadership mattered. John's absence forced Charles to grow as a leader, a dynamic you can explore in character-driven stories. To wrap up, The Treaty of Bretigny offered John a path to freedom, but burdened France with a crushing price. The stage was set for his return, but would France hold together long enough to bring him home? Next, we'll dive into John's release and the challenges of his homecoming. Stay tuned. Chapter 8. The return of the King John's homecoming and challenges. Picture the moment. After 4 years in captivity, you're a king stepping back onto your homeland soil, greeted as a hero, but facing a kingdom on the verge of collapse. In late 1360, King John II finally returned to France, freed by the Treaty of Bretigny. This chapter explores his emotional homecoming, the immediate challenges he faced, and how his absence had reshaped France's political landscape. Let's dive into this bittersweet reunion. John's release came in October 1360, after France delivered the first 600,000 crowns of his ransom. He sailed from Dover to Calais, an English-held port, where he was formally handed over. Chronicles describe a joyous yet tense scene. French nobles and crowds cheered, but the mood was tempered by the treaty's harsh terms. John, now 41, was thinner, worn by stress, but still carried himself with royal dignity. He travelled to Paris, where he was welcomed with processions and bells, though some accounts note the celebrations felt forced. The people were relieved to have their king back, but years of war, taxes, and unrest had eroded trust in the crown. France was a mess when John returned. The economy was crippled, trade had collapsed, fields lay fallow from raids, and the Black Death's shadow lingered. The ransom payments drained the treasury, forcing John to impose new taxes, which sparked grumbling among peasants and townsfolk. The Dauphin Charles had held the kingdom together, but barely. During John's absence, rebellions like the Jacquerie and schemes by Charles of Navarre had exposed deep divisions. Now, John faced the task of unifying a fractured realm. He called a meeting of the Estates General in 1361 to rally support. But many nobles and merchants demanded reforms, wary of his leadership after so long away. John also had to navigate the treaty's fallout. The ceded territories Aquitaine, Calais, and others were now under English control, a humiliating loss. English garrisons in these regions clashed with French locals, creating border tensions. John tried to enforce the treaty's terms, sending officials to collect taxes and maintain order, but resistance grew. Some nobles, loyal to Charles of Navarre, refused to cooperate, seeing John as weakened. Meanwhile, unpaid soldiers turned to banditry, forming free companies that roamed France, looting villages. One chronicler, Jean de Venette, describes these bands as wolves, terrorizing the countryside and undermining John's authority. Personally, John struggled to reclaim his role. He'd been a king in name during captivity, but now he had to prove he could rule. He held lavish courts to reassert his majesty, distributing gifts and titles, but his health was frail, and doubts lingered about his judgment. The treaty required hostages nobles sent to England to guarantee the ransom, and John's own son, Louis of Anjou, was among them. This weighed heavily on him, as did the pressure to pay the remaining 2.4 million crowns. He leaned on advisors, and even astrologers, to guide his decisions, a sign of the uncertainty he faced. For a practical takeaway, John's return is a case study in leadership after crisis. If you're writing a historical drama or playing a strategy game, think about how a ruler rebuilds trust after years away, balancing charisma with tough choices. Try crafting a speech as John to rally your nobles, or simulate his budget crisis. deciding which taxes to enforce versus which rebels to crush. It's a lesson in navigating a fractured power base. To wrap up, John's homecoming was a moment of hope, overshadowed by daunting challenges: economic ruin, political division, and the treaty's burdens. Next, we'll explore how John tried to rebuild France and the unexpected twist that sent him back to England. Keep watching. Chapter 9. Rebuilding a Broken Kingdom. Jan's struggle to rule. Imagine returning as a king to a kingdom that barely recognizes your authority, where every decision feels like walking on a tightrope over a pit of rebellion and ruin. In 1361, King John II faced this daunting reality as he tried to restore order in France after his release from English captivity. This chapter dives into his efforts to rebuild a fractured nation, the mounting pressures of the ransom and treaty obligations, and the personal toll of his weakened rule. Let's explore how John fought to reclaim his crown's power. Back in France, John found a kingdom scarred by war and his absence. The economy was in tatters, trade routes were disrupted, fields lay barren from English raids, and the Black Death's aftermath still crippled communities. The Treaty of Bretigny's terms hung like a dark cloud. France owed 2.4 million gold crowns to complete John's ransom, and vast territories like Aquitaine and Calais were now under English control. To raise funds, John imposed heavy taxes, known as aides and gabelle, on salt and goods. Chronicles, like those of Jean de Venette, describe widespread resentment. Peasants and merchants groaned under the burden, and some towns outright refused to pay. In Paris, citizens whispered that John's long captivity had made him a stranger to their struggles. Politically, John faced a fractured realm. The Dauphin Charles had grown into a capable leader during his father's absence, but their relationship was strained. Charles had pushed for reforms to limit royal power, clashing with John's desire to restore absolute authority. Meanwhile, rogue nobles, like Charles of Navarre, continued stirring trouble, rallying dissenters who saw John as a weakened king. The countryside was plagued by free companies, bands of unemployed. Soldiers turned bandits who looted villages and defied royal edicts. John tried to suppress them, sending troops to areas like Normandy, but his forces were stretched thin. One account tells of a skirmish in 1361 where royal knights were ambushed by these mercenaries, highlighting John's struggle to enforce order. To reassert his majesty, John leaned on spectacle. He held grand courts in Paris, Amiens, and other cities, distributing gifts and pardons to win loyalty. Records show he spent heavily on feasts, new robes, and even falcons, echoing his lavish habits in captivity. But this strained the treasury further, and his health, already fragile from years of stress, began to falter. He relied on advisors and astrologers to guide his moves, a sign of his uncertainty. The ransom payments were another headache. France struggled to collect gold, and delays angered the English, who still held French hostages, including John's son Louis of Anjou as collateral. John also faced border tensions in ceded territories. Like Aquitaine, English governors clashed with French locals, sparking skirmishes that threatened the fragile peace. John sent envoys to negotiate with Edward III, but the English were uncompromising, demanding prompt payments. By 1362, only a fraction of the ransom had been paid, and John's letters, preserved in archives, reveal his growing despair. He wrote to Charles, urging unity, but the kingdom's divisions ran deep. For a practical angle, John's struggle is a lesson in crisis leadership. If you're writing a historical novel or playing a strategy game, Think about how a leader rebuilds trust after a long absence, balancing displays of strength with addressing real grievances. Try drafting a royal proclamation as John to rally your people, or simulate his budget crisis, deciding whether to prioritize taxes or military campaigns. It's a stark reminder that ruling isn't just about power, it's about perception. To wrap up, John's efforts to rebuild France were a grueling battle against economic ruin, rebellion, and his own weakened authority. But an unexpected twist was about to pull him back into captivity, testing his chivalric honor. Let's dive into that final chapter next. Chapter 10. The Chained King's final act. Return to captivity. Picture a king, finally free, choosing to return to his captor's land, sacrificing himself for honor and his kingdom's future. In 1363, King John II made this astonishing decision, returning to England in a move that stunned Europe. This final chapter explores why John went back, the tragic end of his life, and the legacy of his tortured captivity. Let's uncover the dramatic close of this saga. By 1363, France was buckling under the Treaty of Bretigny's demands. The ransom payments lagged, with only about 1 million of the 3 million gold crowns paid. Worse, John's son Louis of Anjou, a hostage in England, broke his parole and fled to France, a grave breach of chivalric honor. In medieval Europe, a noble's word was sacred, and Louis's escape humiliated John and jeopardized the fragile peace with England. Edward III, furious, threatened to resume the war, demanding the remaining ransom and full control of ceded territories. John, now 44 and in failing health, faced a heart-wrenching choice: stay and risk war, or return to England to uphold his honor and renegotiate. John chose to go back. In January 1364, he sailed to England, leaving France under the Dauphin Charles's regency. Chronicles, like Froissart's, describe his decision as a mix of chivalry and pragmatism. He believed his presence could secure better terms and prevent further conflict. He arrived in London to a surprised but respectful welcome, housed again at the Savoy Palace. The English treated him as a guest, but he was effectively a prisoner again, his movements watched. Negotiations resumed, but progress was slow. Edward III demanded the full ransom, while John offered hostages and partial payments. Records show John hosted feasts and gifted English lords, trying to charm his way to leniency, but his health deteriorated rapidly. By April 1364, John fell gravely ill, likely from a combination of stress, a weakened constitution, and possibly a respiratory ailment. On April 8, 1364, he died at the Savoy Palace, far from home. His death shocked both nations. The English mourned him as a noble figure, holding a grand funeral, while in France, his passing was met with grief and relief. Grief for a king who embodied chivalry, relief that the ransom burden might ease. His body was sent back to France, buried at Saint Denis, the traditional resting place of French kings. John's legacy is complex. His captivity exposed France's vulnerabilities, but his return to England showed a rare commitment to honor, earning him respect even among enemies. The Dauphin Charles, now Charles V, inherited a stronger throne, using lessons from his father's absence to centralize power and rebuild France. The 100 Years' War continued, but John's sacrifice bought time for recovery. His story, preserved in chronicles and songs, became a symbol of chivalric duty, though some historians argue his decisions, like signing harsh treaties, weakened France long-term. For a practical takeaway, John's final act is a goldmine for storytellers or gamers. Imagine writing a scene where a leader chooses honor over freedom, or role-playing John's decision in a strategy game. Would you return to captivity or risk war? It's a timeless dilemma about duty versus survival. If you enjoyed this journey through John's captivity, hit that like button, subscribe, and comment below. What would you have done in John's shoes? For historians, check primary sources like Froissart's Chronicles for vivid details to enrich your research. To wrap up, John II's return to captivity and his death in 1364 closed a chapter of sacrifice and struggle. His story reminds us that, even in defeat, a king's choices can shape a nation's future. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to join us for more epic historical tales.